They said he died of natural causes. But what if the truth is far more horrifying? What if one of England's kings, disgraced, imprisoned, abandoned, was murdered in a way so grotesque it was scrubbed from official records? This is the story of Edward II, humiliated in life and in death, erased from history. The year is 1327. A king is dead, or is he? King Edward II, once a symbol of English strength and royalty, lay at the mercy of those he trusted most. But what if the official story of his murder, one drenched in fire and humiliation, was just that, a story? The tale goes that he died in a most grotesque way imaginable. A red-hot poker driven into his body by the very people who should have protected him. A king reduced to a lifeless body, his death designed not for revenge, but for pure public spectacle. And yet, this image, burned into the minds of generations, is not the whole truth. What really happened in that cell? Why did it take years for the world to learn of Edward's so-called death? And why has history turned a blind eye to the most terrifying possibility of all, that he might not have died in 1327 at all? The evidence is here. The myths, they crumble. The real story, it's darker than you could ever imagine. But why was Edward, a once mighty king, abandoned by his own allies? Who were the true masterminds of his undoing? What if I told you the horror of that night wasn't just about Edward's death, but about what came after? The calculated, brutal erasure of a king's very identity. You think you know the end of this story, but I promise you the real truth lies in the shadows. And it's not the king who's humiliated. It's the very monarchy that betrayed him. What if Edward II's death was a lie? How far would the throne go to erase a king's legacy? Do you think Edward II's death was truly the end? Or did the real betrayal begin long after his supposed death? Comment below with your theories. And if you think his murder was a political ploy to erase his legacy, what was the crown hiding? In the year 1327, King Edward II was found dead in a cold, damp cell, allegedly murdered by a brutal medieval execution. But what if I told you that the real story of his death was not what history books have told you? What if the story behind his gruesome end was far more sinister and even more humiliating than you could ever imagine? Edward II was not just a weak king. He was a monarch consumed by insecurities. His relationship with Piers Gaveston, seen by the court as an affront to both his dignity and that of England, was more than just a political misstep. It was an emotional anchor. A man so insecure in his own ability to rule, he sought solace in Gaveston, who was as much a lover as he was a symbol of Edward's deepest vulnerabilities. But what happens when a ruler lets his personal weakness define his reign? It sets in motion a slow but irreversible descent into chaos. The ordinances of 1311 were not just a legal document. They were a declaration of war against the very soul of Edward II's kingship. The nobles didn't just want power, they wanted vengeance. The exiled Gaveston was only the beginning. Behind the whispers, the letters, and the legal decrees lay something far darker. Secret plots, covert alliances, the shadow of an empire about to split in two. But who exactly was Edward's real enemy? Was it the nobility, or was it his own blood? But the question remains, was Edward II's death at Berkeley Castle the result of a failed assassination? Or was it something far more calculated? A ritualistic act to destroy a king's legacy once and for all? Or was there a hidden force, pulling the strings from behind the curtain, waiting for Edward to make one fatal misstep? And could the real mastermind have been someone we least expect? The story isn't over yet. The collapse of kingship, when power turns to ashes and betrayal is inevitable. What if everything you thought you knew about Edward II's death, the red-hot poker, the castle, the whispers of betrayal, was a lie? Edward II, crowned in 1307, was the heir of Edward I, the brutal hammer of the Scots. But from the start, the son failed to live up to the towering shadow of his father, a king whose military might and reputation had brought Scotland to its knees. Instead, Edward II's reign was plagued by failures, the most catastrophic of which was his blind loyalty to Piers Gaveston, a man so despised by the nobles that he became the symbol of Edward's weakness. Imagine being a king, expected to rule, but the weight of your crown is nothing more than a reminder of your insecurities. Edward's fatal flaw? His desperate need for affection, and that need led him to trust the wrong people, people who were willing to destroy him. But what if this was all by design? What if Gaveston wasn't just Edward's lover, but his only anchor in a sea of uncertainty? And what if this dependency, this broken king, set in motion a deadly chain of events that would end in his own brutal execution? By 1321, Despenser wasn't just a king's favorite. He was the puppet master. More cunning, more vicious than Gaveston ever was, Despenser's ambition grew so rapidly that he controlled Edward's every move. Where Gaveston was hated, Despenser was feared. And unlike Gaveston, Despenser wasn't about to be a symbol. He wanted to be the king himself. Despenser wasn't loyal. He was calculating. His cruelty wasn't born out of malice, but strategic necessity. Every act of tyranny was designed to keep Edward dependent. But why would a man so powerful want a weak king in the first place? Despenser wasn't alone in his machinations. What if, hidden behind the political landscape, there were even darker forces at play? What if Despenser and Edward weren't just ruling England? They were playing a game of life and death, using the throne as their own sick game board. In 1325, Queen Isabella's mission to France took a shocking turn. As she met with King Charles IV, Isabella was no longer the dutiful wife. In truth, she was planning her own political future, and with Roger Mortimer by her side, it became clear she wasn't coming back to England for her husband. Isabella wasn't just spurned, she was desperate. After years of humiliation and living in the shadow of her husband's weakness, she finally made the only choice that would give her power. But did she defect for love, or was she seduced by Mortimer's ambitions, a man just as hungry for the crown as Despenser? Isabella's betrayal was far more than political. It was personal. While history paints her as the victim, what if she too was playing a game of survival, using Mortimer as a pawn to get what she wanted, an empire, a future, and a king's head on a silver platter? When Edward II was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle, his fate was sealed. But what truly led to his death? Was it the brutal hands of Despenser's men, or was there something far darker at play? The infamous red-hot poker theory, often repeated by history, tells us one story. But what if that's the lie? Edward's end wasn't the culmination of a power struggle. It was a public execution of his soul. But did he die because of his enemies? Or did he die because he gave up the moment he was in prison? Was his death the result of his own crushing despair? History's version of Edward's death may have been shaped to hide the truth. That Edward's demise wasn't just physical, it was a brutal erosion of his spirit. The execution was a symbol, but the real death happened long before, as the king was consumed by his own isolation and insecurities. Was the brutal act at Berkeley Castle not just the killing of a king, but the execution of a man broken beyond repair? Was Edward II's death a tragic accident of fate, or was it something far darker, an intentional breaking of a man who had already lost everything? What do you think truly led to his death? Was it his enemies, or was he already a prisoner of his own despair? Leave a comment below with your theories. Let's talk about the real story. This story, Edward II's rise, betrayal, and brutal end, is more than just a tale of kings and queens. It's about the cost of power, the human heart, and the secrets we bury to protect ourselves. But the real question is, what price are we willing to pay for loyalty and revenge? If you've felt the weight of these questions, hit that like button. Because history isn't just something we read, it's something we feel. And if this journey has made you rethink everything you thought you knew, make sure to comment below. I want to know your thoughts. Could this have been avoided? Who was the real villain here? Subscribe so you don't miss out on the shocking details of history, because what you've just heard is only the tip of the iceberg. And share this with someone who needs to know the dark, hidden side of royal betrayal, because sometimes the truth is far more twisted than we dare imagine. Betrayal and fall. The queen returns, not with peace, but with vengeance. In the silence of Berkeley Castle, a king was waiting for his death. But it wasn't just his throne that was stripped away, it was his very identity. But here's the question. Was his fall inevitable, or was it orchestrated from the shadows by the very people who should have protected him? Isabella had once been a pawn in a political game, married to Edward II to solidify England's ties with France. But betrayal and neglect from her husband, the rise of his favorites, and the sapping of her own power transformed her. She was not just a queen, but a woman on the edge of her humanity. When Isabella fled to France in 1325, it was portrayed as a diplomatic mission, but in truth, it was her first move in a long game of survival. She knew the only way to survive in a court that had abandoned her was to align with someone who could give her the power she had lost, Roger Mortimer. As Isabella leaves her husband's kingdom, a question lingers. Was she planning her return for a peaceful resolution, or was this her final act of rebellion? Her alliances with the French and her growing relationship with Mortimer pointed to something far more dangerous. Isabella was crossing into enemy territory. But what did Mortimer truly want? Was he a lover, or was he a player in a deadly game? And who would be the real puppet master? Roger Mortimer, a figure often overshadowed by Isabella's role in history, is a perfect example of ruthless ambition. He wasn't just a lover, he was the strategist, the brain behind the operation, and perhaps even the true mastermind of Edward's downfall. Mortimer's rise to power wasn't purely through the lens of romance. He had been plotting since before Isabella's departure, leveraging his status and connections to gain support from the disillusioned English barons. Mortimer knew that Edward II's weak leadership was the key to his own power. His true ambition was never simply to dethrone Edward, but to rule England as he saw fit. While Isabella is remembered as the queen who betrayed her husband, Mortimer's behind-the-scenes influence is often overlooked. He was playing a high-stakes game where one misstep meant the end of everything. But as Mortimer played his hand, there was a larger question. What price was Isabella willing to pay for revenge? And how far was she willing to go to keep Mortimer on her side? The invasion of 1326 was not the peaceful restoration of order as it was often portrayed. It was a meticulously executed coup, driven not only by vengeance, but by a desperate need for control. The people cheered when Despenser was executed, but they didn't know that Edward's fate had already been sealed by his closest allies. He was no longer a king, but a liability. What truly sealed Edward's doom wasn't just his deposition, it was his failure to adapt. He refused to see that the world around him was changing. He relied too heavily on favorites like Gaveston and Despenser, who were more interested in exploiting royal power than serving the throne. This toxic combination of emotional dependence and political naivete made him an easy target. When Edward was captured in 1326, it wasn't just a monarch being brought down, it was the symbolic collapse of an entire system. But Edward was still a king, a man whose blood ran blue. What happens when you remove the title, but the person still stands? Edward II was no longer king, but what do you do with a man who has nothing left to lose, but still wears the crown in his soul? Could his fall have been stopped? Or had the anger of an entire kingdom set this tragedy in motion long before the first blow was struck? Berkeley Castle was not just a prison for a fallen king. It became the place where his humanity was extinguished. Though rumors of a brutal, torturous death have circulated for centuries, the truth is much darker. Edward's demise was not simply the result of a vengeful plot. It was the culmination of a political system that had long since broken down. While the infamous red-hot poker rumor persists, modern historians suggest a more chilling possibility. Edward II may have been suffocated, a more dignified yet brutal end for a king whose mind and spirit had already been crushed. The secrecy surrounding his death and the ever-changing story of his imprisonment leaves us wondering, was this just an execution, or was Edward's life extinguished in a calculated final act of public silence? Edward's death was not a simple matter of vengeance. What happened behind the cold stone walls of Berkeley Castle was far more sinister. But who would benefit from hiding the true cause of his death? And why would they keep such a dark secret? What do you think really happened to Edward II in Berkeley Castle? Was it murder, or did the man who had once been king simply give up on life? Share your thoughts below, because the truth may be even more twisted than we think. Death in the dark, where truth is twisted by silence. The night Edward II died, was it an execution or a political performance designed to show the world what happens when a king falls from grace? The death of Edward II, officially announced in September 1327, has been buried under layers of lies, obfuscation, and deliberate misdirection. His death was swift, but its story, its real story, was designed to be anything but simple. And yet it remains one of the most perplexing chapters of medieval history. Let's start with what we do know. Official version: the king died, a peaceful death after months of captivity. A shadowy report, no witnesses, and zero forensic evidence. But is that enough to explain the death of a once powerful monarch, deposed and humiliated, yet still capable of being dangerous to the throne? What happened behind those cold stone walls? And then, the rumors. The truth is not as clean as the history books claim. The official narrative says it was a natural death, but historians who've examined the case differ. Why, after all, does no one seem to confirm this death? No one, not even Edward's enemies, seem to witness it. If he died of old age, of exhaustion, why the silence? And more importantly, why were those closest to him, especially the warden, so eager to cover up the details? Do you really think it was that simple? Now let's get into something darker, the infamous red-hot poker theory. First whispered by chronicler Thomas de la Mor, it became the stuff of legend, a horrifying tale, a brutal execution, a public humiliation, an act so vile that it was said to have made even the toughest of knights turn away. But here's the twist. That story was fabricated. Fabricated, yes. The red-hot poker was a calculated myth, created not just to terrorize the populace, but to send a very specific message. don't challenge the crown. The poker didn't burn Edward's flesh, but the idea of it, that's where the true power lay. The rumor was weaponized, and it was weaponized in such a way that it ensured no one would dare question the monarchy again. It was psychological warfare. But here's where things get interesting. The Fieschi Letter. Remember that mysterious letter, discovered in the 1330s, which claimed Edward wasn't dead at all? What if this was the real reason behind the cover-up? Edward II was inconveniently alive. But was he? The Fieschi Letter says he escaped into exile. Why would such a letter exist if Edward had died in some dramatic public spectacle? What if Edward had been hidden away all along, alive, waiting to return? Could the legend of the red-hot poker be nothing more than an elaborate cover-up to hide the truth? And what if we've been lied to all along? In the days following Edward's fall, those in power, the nobles, the queen, didn't just want to end a king's reign. No, they wanted to bury his legacy so deep that it would never rise again. This wasn't a simple matter of vengeance. It was calculated humiliation. It was public theater meant to fracture the very idea of kingship. A king who could not only be deposed but erased. But here's the true story. Edward was never meant to be forgotten. He was meant to be reviled. The real power lies in the myth, Edward's symbolic death. He had failed in his reign, yes, but in his symbolic annihilation, those in power sent a message to every future monarch. Never let your enemies see your weakness. So what really happened to Edward II? Was he murdered, or did he escape? Could the greatest conspiracy in English history still be hiding in plain sight? The real story is just beginning, and trust me, the ending is darker than anything you've been told. What really happened to Edward II, and what it means for power today, will change the way you see history. Myths, memory, and the man who decides how a king is remembered? What if the history we know is nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion? And what if Edward II was never really dead at all? Edward II, a king lost to history, but was he erased, or did he simply escape the fate written for him? Most believe his death in 1327 was final, a humiliating end to a reign soaked in scandal, weakness, and betrayal. But what if there was more to the story? What if he survived? What if his death was merely the beginning of a much darker tale? As we enter the shadowy world of medieval England, let's peel back the layers of myth, deceit, and forgotten history that surround Edward II's death. In 1327, England's once glorious king was deposed, humiliated, and imprisoned. But the details of his death were never clear. Was he murdered? Was he simply forgotten? Or was there something far more sinister at play? The first theory, Edward died a natural death. The official version, but it doesn't hold up. His capture, his imprisonment at Berkeley Castle, all led to this point. But no one could explain why his death was so sudden, so perfect for the powers that be. Did they silence him, or was he allowed to die to serve a greater political purpose? Or was it their hot poker that killed him? The infamous story, passed down by Thomas de la More, paints a vivid picture of horror. Edward, writhing in pain as a red-hot poker was shoved into his body. This is the tale many have clung to, an act of ultimate violence reserved for a failed king. But as shocking as it sounds, could this have been a lie to cover up something darker? The third possibility, perhaps the most chilling of all, is the Fieschi Letter. Written years after Edward's supposed death, it claims that the former king didn't die at Berkeley Castle. Instead, he escaped. He lived, in exile, hiding, somewhere in Europe. The very idea of a king, humiliated in life, now living in the shadows as a ghost. How does that change everything we thought we knew? Could a king's disappearance be just as powerful as his death? And what would happen if we found out the king never truly died? But let's not stop there. The myths surrounding Edward II's death were not just crafted to protect the royal family. They were a necessary part of political theater. Edward's death, whether natural, brutal, or fake, served a greater purpose: to silence him, to make him a symbol, a cautionary tale for all who might challenge the power of the throne. This was no longer just about a king. It was about control, about rewriting the narrative. And the question we must ask is this: why was the world so desperate to erase Edward II, even from the history books? What did they fear so much about his true legacy? Edward II was not just erased, he was reimagined. But why? And what does that say about the power of history itself? Maybe the greatest humiliation wasn't how he died. It was that history nearly erased who he really was. Imagine being crowned with gold, only to die in silence, unmourned, your body never confirmed, your tomb possibly empty. Historians dismiss the whispers. But a letter from a Genoese priest claims the king escaped, lived, and watched the crown pass him by from a monastery window. They say he wandered northern Italy. He wore no crown, but he wept for one. But if the king didn't die in that cell, who did? And why was his heart buried with the queen who betrayed him? What do you believe? Was Edward murdered, or did he die watching history forget him? Comment your theory below. Let's see who believes in ghosts and who believes in cover-ups. History doesn't whisper, it buries. And every grave has two truths, one carved in stone, the other left behind in silence. If this story made you question what you thought you knew, don't let it end here. Like if you felt the weight of forgotten power, comment your theory. Was Edward a ghost king, or just a man broken by betrayal? Subscribe if you're ready to dig deeper into the stories they didn't want remembered. Share this with someone who still believes kings always die on thrones, because sometimes the most dangerous truth is the one history tried to erase.